Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. I have with me today George of Ask George, of Dr. George Hariri, of everything that we've ever podcasted about. George, how are you doing today?
Good. This was a funny episode because we're both fired up about the same thing, which is kind of odd. We both normally don't have kind of a bone to pick with
Yeah.
the same type of thing, but I think it just really goes to show the importance of the topic today. So today we are talking about buyer's representation and, how to make sure that you are well represented in the process of a transaction of buying a practice. And I think that this is just a very near and dear to my heart topic.
Yeah, and I'm pissed about it, which is very surprising. Like you said, I don't typically get upset. I've been pretty play nice in the sandbox with other people in the space who do things. And unfortunately, I've seen some people enter into ownership and have these really hard conversations, like multiple doctors I've talked with in the past couple months who bought incorrectly. And this is the whole thing we've been talking about for the reason I started Shared Practices was the thought was, if you buy right, this one decision can change the trajectory of the rest of your life. And if you buy wrong, this can make you more miserable than any asset you ever purchase. And therefore, maybe you should do some homework and find someone who can really guide you through this, and do it the right way, and understand the implications of the cascade effect of buying right. And I've just seen people not arm themselves with tools, not hire people, or even worse, which is why I'm pissed, hire someone and still buy a lemon, still buy a practice that sucks. And so that's why I'm fired up. And I'm just mad, like viscerally angry. So this is good, George.
Yeah, so I think, I'm going to just real quick, not to be a promotional thing, but just real quick talk about why we have such strong conviction on this one. So
Yeah.
we have a course coming up, Pathway to Ownership. We teach this idea in that course of buying a ready-to-grow practice, like a practice that is you buy it and it grows post-acquisition. And then we have a service called Buyer's Representation Services where we really dig deep into offices to make sure that they are really ready to grow and you're buying an opportunity rather than buying a problem. And so I just recorded Practice Underwater Part 1 with Dr. Nesto. And Dr. Nesto bought a practice and it had $690,000 of collections, and Nesto paid like $475. This is all in an upcoming Practice Underwater, and the practice is halved, less than half its collections now from where it was pre-acquisition. And
Okay.
Nesto has two practices. So there's this one practice. This one's losing money
Yeah.
and can't sell it. The note is, because what happens when the practice dips after the acquisition, now your debt on the practice is more than it's worth. So you're now in a stressful situation where
You're
you
up to
essentially
it.
can't exit it without paying hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so it's a really tough situation. And I mean, it's just, I think you and I really feel for the person who puts themselves in a situation like that, because then you're kind of stuck in a way, and who wants to be stuck in a situation that's not working?
This is, in my opinion, as a first time owner, this is the worst case scenario, that is preventable right off the bat. You buy the wrong practice, it's worth less than you owe immediately. You're not earning a lot of money out of it. You don't have a lot of bandwidth to pay for marketing, pay for coaching, do anything. You just feel like hire people that you need to hire, and you're stuck in this grind without access to help for a long time until the debt is paid down, or you manage to get the collections up and the profitability up. And then you can kind of breathe for a second, and then you can make a decision. Do I trash this thing and walk away after 3 years, or do I stick it out for another 3 years and try and grow it and turn it finally into something profitable? And so I think we have erred on being fairly bullish on practice
Yeah.
ownership. Um, and I think we should have been using a little bit more fear, a little bit more doom and gloom all the way along. Like, people can screw themselves over, and we don't hear those conversations as often because people are ashamed and embarrassed and stressed, and there's a ton of anxiety around what they've done. And people will hear the whole story of yours
Yeah.
on Practice Underwater. Can I tell mine just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to say one thing, and then I'd like you to tell yours. So, I think the thing, when we're talking about getting into ownership, it can be an amazing thing, right? But something that everyone needs to consider is if you are a dentist who is going to a broker or you're going to the listings and you're looking at what's available, it has most likely been passed up by 3 to 5 DSOs or buyers or whatever before it comes to your opportunity. And so brokers who have these undesirable assets tend to push them on unsophisticated dentist buyers. And like, that's just an unfortunate thing, right? So, you just kind of need to keep that in mind when you're in the process of getting into ownership. Is if not careful, this can be not a great outcome. But obviously, I still will go of the set that there's a lot of great outcomes to be had.
Yeah.
But it requires that diligence and that research to know what's a lemon versus what's a great opportunity. So please tell your story, Richard.
Well, and I think the last part of that sentence is, if you buy something with a bunch of risks and liabilities, you should at least know ahead of time
Yes.
what you're buying. The worst is you think you're buying opportunity, profitability, a healthy practice, and then 2 months, 3 months, 6 months later, you're like, what happened? This is not what I thought this was going to be. So that was the story on mine. It was major metropolitan area with like a bougie downtown type scenario. And this dentist wanted to be a fee-for-service dentist. And so he found a fee-for-service practice. Practice was collecting 1.6, full valuation of 1.6. A decent number of operatories. Eventually, I think it had 8 ops. So it's like, it's got the space that like this could be a healthy 2 doctor practice someday. But the big miss was both the true number of active patients and the amount of dentistry that had been done on the patients. So it's like this dentist went in and did every full mouth rehab and crowned every tooth on the 400 active patients that were, 600
Only
active.
400?
It was about 600 like active patients that were there. And like the guy's just seeing like collections drop. They don't have the new patient game figured out. New patient numbers were low with the last doctor. So he's like stuck in this high end area. It's fee for service. That's what he wants to do. And I'm like, maybe consider opening new insurances. But just while you're hemorrhaging, and collections are coming down and down and down, he's getting nervous. And the thing that got me really fired up was that he had representation. He had a company come in and do an evaluation of whether this was a good practice to buy. And from a reputable person in the industry that lots of people trust, and they have good reviews online and publications that you can read. And I even thought well of this person. And now I'm like, how dare you let this dentist buy a lemon? Because even in my short 30, 40-minute conversation with this dentist, I was like, no, you should have seen this coming a mile away. If there was any sort of true due diligence, digging into the charts, looking through the numbers, this was a very like red flag. Hey, by the way, the actual number of patients and the amount of dentistry that's being done and the procedure codes that are being done, this might be a problem in combination without a new patient flow that can support replacing those patients and getting more.
Let's go through the diligence process for our audience here, and let's
Yeah.
try to provide them with like on the journey of diligence, right? So I think one thing I just want to say, right, it's really hard to, I don't want somebody listening to this episode to think, oh man, they're just promoting their buyer's representation services. But at the same time, I just really deeply believe in the importance of good buyer's representation, and I think we're really, really good at it. So I'm going to just like kind of talk about what we do and why, and where along that process we would catch some of these things. So
And one more thing with this too. In the original seasons of the Archived Shared Practices podcast, we went through and we had many episodes on like trying to do like 40 to 50% of this on your own. But even back then, the intention was, let's get you to the point where you're like, I think this practice is worth doing the true due diligence on. And it would not have been that like, oh, you're just doing this on your own. So it's like, we could walk you through a whole bunch of steps, but even me, if I look at a listing, I look at the documents that a broker sets up, like I'm like, okay, I have a good idea what's going on here, but we need to dig. There is work to be done to actually know what's going on in these practices. And I'm not going to do that work. Like that's just like it's not worth my time. But we've got a team of people that do that, and most dentists have never done that, and they'll never do it, and they don't know what to do.
Yeah, and I think, Richard, to that point, just so everyone knows, we now do what's called a free analysis. So we actually will, for free, have somebody send us their just kind of quick numbers, and we'll just give them the quick yay or nay. So even the math that we taught on the podcast before, we now just provide that. We call it a free analysis or a free look. I think that, but anyway, nonetheless, right? So when the first thing that we do, so I think the biggest difference between what we do and what an accountant or maybe this buyer's representation person did is they're going to do their analysis wholly financial. So they're going to look at the profit and loss. They're going to look at the income statement. They're going to look at the tax returns. They're going to look at all the financial stuff. And they're going to essentially just assume that that carries forward. And I think that that's a pretty big false assumption both ways, right? You usually, when you change the dentist in a practice, you're changing the complexity of just the complexion of the collections is going to change so drastically because of the procedure mix, the diagnostic tendencies, the rapport with patients, all of that stuff is going to change. And so, what we do is we pull reports from the practice management software on how many cleanings were done in the last 12 months. And that's going to give us a really good idea of the patient base size. And we're not going to go off of one of the biggest areas where people get misled is active patients or patient base, or even they'll even use the word not active. They'll just use total patients, right? It's like that's essentially anybody who has ever been to this location,
Right.
and so that's not real. And so you need to like do a grounded analysis in like what are the active, like real number of patients who are in this practice.
And in defense of the sketchy people who are misrepresenting, the practice management softwares aren't really good at outputting what's really going on anyways. Like there's
Yeah.
like buttons you can check like total patients. And you're like, oh, that sounds good. I want to see the total number of patients in my practice. And like, well, no, that's just like the literally your kid could have come in and like put in first name, last name accidentally while you're at lunch. Now there's 50 new patients and the software doesn't know any different.
Yeah. And, this process we do remote into the practice management software and pull reports. That's how
Yeah.
we get it, right? So in Nesto's example, the practice underwater guest, so this practice had 1 day a week of hygiene that was purchased. So you think of, a practice doing 790,000 per year, it should have between 4 to 6 days a week of hygiene. And so Nesto purchased a practice that had 1 day. The hygienist came in 1 day per week and saw patients.
Mm.
And the patient base was like 400 people because, it was that's even half. Like that's actually a pretty big patient base for 1 day a week of hygiene. But like this was
Yeah.
all on four, full mouth rehab, and 1 day a week of hygiene. And so like we very quickly would have flagged this and we
Yeah.
would have said, no, you're acquiring 1 day a week of hygiene. For all we know, that's $250 per year in, collections. And then, Nesto purchased it at it was doing 690 historically. And then Nesto's first year did 310, right? So it's like that just came right back to where you would expect it to be with 1 day a week of hygiene.
Yeah.
And so like that's not a good outcome. Now, to Richard's point, right? What we would have, so let's just say, so Richard, this practice doing 1.6 fee for service. How many days a week of hygiene? Do you have any idea?
Um, I think it was three and a
4,
half.
3.5.
Yeah, that's why I was like,
Wow.
it's between 600 to 700 patients
Yeah.
was kind of what he was like estimating and based on the hygiene data. So I mean, this is where I think we do need to explain some like real basic terms for people who are just catching up on this kind of stuff. Days of hygiene and like prophies done in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
Can we correlate those to people and just explain why those are so important when we're
Mm-hmm.
like looking at a practice's website? If you can tell there's a full-time hygienist and you confirm on the phone that hygienist is available 4 days a week, you can actually put together a lot of information about the active patient base in broad strokes because of this knowledge and understanding we have.
Yeah. So a hygienist who works Monday through Thursday or 4 days a week and has a full schedule means that they're able to service around 800 patients. So it's 200 patients per day of hygiene per week. So we don't look at, because I remember there was one time this dentist came to me and they were like, oh, I have this practice. It's doing 500,000 per year with 3 hygienists. I'm like, what? Three
What?
hygienists? This sounds awesome. And it's like two of them they all worked 1 day a week. So it's
Right.
like, but they had 3 hygiene days with 3 hygienists. I'm like, well, that's not as attractive. So you're really looking for how many people are coming in those first 6 months that I'm owning the practice, right? That's really what you want to figure out. And what you're saying with 3.5 days, like that's a problem because 3.5 days, like that's not a lot for a practice doing 1.6 million, right?
Right.
3.5 days of hygiene, that means you have, right, 700 patients, in your practice. You would assume 700,000, 800,000 per year is kind of like where you should expect that practice to be. And so if it's doing 1.6, then that's a red flag because you're doing so much more, and then they're valuing it based on the 1.6, and so the purchase price was 1.6.
1.6, a full 1.6. Like
Yeah,
that's why I was so pissed was this person got buyer's rep. And it was a high fee area and their fee for service and they're doing full mouth rehabs and cosmetics and veneers and all this stuff, but no new patient flow. And
yeah.
so it, it was just run dry at that point. And
So
yeah,
how many months post ownership is this person post close?
I can't remember. It's been like 3 or 4 weeks now. I want to say it was like 6 months or less.
Okay, and how much has the practice dipped? Like a
I mean, they're
lot?
down to like 1.2 ish, I
So
think.
about 100 a month?
Yeah.
I mean, that's better than you would expect given the number of patients, right? Like that you
Right.
can't tell somebody that because they're very frustrated that it dipped, and they're,
You're like
because then
this
your
could
practice
work.
debt at the high interest rate is 1.6 million. So like,
Yeah.
it's not a good situation, but I think relative to the number of patients in the practice, it seems to be like there seems to be a good amount of, revenue being
Yeah.
performed.
Yeah. So it wasn't irredeemable, but it's like if he wants to build back up a cosmetic high end fee for service practice, he's got to solve his new patient
Yeah, a
count
lot
and
of
he's got a
marketing.
lot of marketing, ground marketing, social media marketing, paid marketing, like every ounce of his soul goes into marketing for the next couple of years. And he either needs to be patient with that process and make very little for a long time, and or exception of insurances,
Yeah, but
which is
insurances then do a whole other thing because then you're going to essentially lower your top line of the patients that you already have there.
yeah,
So,
yeah, it's hard.
so I think that this is an interesting one, right? Because, where the pain point, and I don't want to like elaborate on why it's painful, but I just think it's good for people to understand that the 1.6 million dollar practice purchase price comes with that loan payment, that then, like, that's the marketing budget right there, is the difference between what this person paid versus what they should have paid. They should have paid much less, and then they should have like five
More
thousand
money
dollars a
to
month
market with.
of open budget to market, right? But now that $5,000 a month that they could have spent on marketing is going extra to the bank, right? They're probably paying close to, I bet it's between, what's it, over $16,000 a month or something like that. I bet they're paying, right? So
Yeah,
it's a hefty note. So it's like that's too big of a debt burden on a practice without that many patients. And then, so the other thing that we look at that would have flagged this is what's called the 3 to 4 surface filling to crown ratio. So
mm,
you look at the number of crowns that a practice does, and you look at the number of 3 to 4 surface fillings that the practice does, and that would have picked up the full mouth rehab right there. You would have been like, why are we doing so many crowns compared to how many fillings we're doing? That would have been another thing that the buyer should have looked at, right? So if a buyer were working with us and looking at this practice, we would have said 3.5 days a week of hygiene. That's not that many for the amount of revenue. There's a ton of crowns being done compared to the number of large fillings. Like, and then, you can kind of give them your synopsis about how this would be tough to replicate, and the revenue most likely will go down, and, then kind of just inform the buyer.
and even these numbers, it's like if someone saw it, they're like, oh, I think we're supposed to look for this, and they were uninformed about it, they'd be like, sweet, this practice, they only do buildups, they don't do fillings, they just do crowns. I
Yeah.
want to buy this thing. It's like,
Yeah.
no, no,
No,
no,
you don't.
no, you don't.
No. So, I think we've been negative for a while now. Do we
Sorry.
want? No,
Yeah.
no. I think it's good. I think it's good because like I think what you said is true, right? Where like I think the shared practices podcast at times can come things from a positive perspective, not considering the fact that reality has positive and negative. And so like I think you know we've communicated why this is important, right? And let me just say something else around this, right? As a dentist, you're trading in pre-ownership. You're going to your associateship every day, and or whatever how many days a week you're working, and you go there in exchange for an income. Well, when you buy a practice, you're going to go to a different place, but you're going to go to a place in exchange for an income. And if you are taking on more stress, more work, more debt, then you should be in a better situation going somewhere, right? You should be going to an office, be your own boss, have debt, pay it to the bank, and at the end of the day, be in a better situation. And what can get very frustrating for people is when you buy a practice and you leave an associateship where you were making more with less stress to making less with more stress. That's not like that. Then that I've actually talked to people who have gone into this and they've, not purchased correctly, or they've had like early ownership expenses or stuff. And they're like, man, why am I like, I was making more. Now I make less. I have more things to do. I'm working on the weekends and on my off days. Like, what is this? And I
Yeah.
think that is a very real thing. It's compounding when it's like negative compounds upon negative where, you can get start beating yourself up a little bit. Is that something that you've experienced, Richard, in talking to this individual?
Oh, yeah. Well, and actually, a lot of like this is one of multiple conversations in the past. I mean, just recently I opened up on social media about anxiety and panic attacks. Like that's been a new thing for me in the last year. And there was a bunch of people who there was like 80 comments on that post in one of these Facebook groups. And as I had more conversation with people, like there this is like you can do so much good with practice ownership, and you can create such a battle for yourself, so much stress. And so we have, like, it's been our mission, like, hey, anyone who will listen to this podcast, we're going to try and give you as much information to buy right, so the moment you walk in, you've got the chance to not only make more money day one, you're in control, and you've got potential. You're like, okay, I can grow the income of this practice and grow my net worth. And I'm not just like breaking even and paying down a loan. Like that is the worst way to be, other than losing money. Breaking even compared to an associateship and paying down the loan, you've just missed out on really great opportunity by buying those practices. And you should know ahead of time if there's a high likelihood. Like I actually bought a practice where the bank was like, meh, we don't want to give you extra money that you want to buy a CBCT because of the financials of this practice. And I had to go get an SBA loan. And it was like me kind of knowingly buying one of these practices that had some red flags, but I was informed. Like I knew that I was buying a denture and implant practice that financials were not glowing. Like they weren't as great as they should have been. And I had a harder first year than I wanted to have. As like, before shared practices group had figured out it was before it was formed. It was like I was doing my thing, you guys are doing your thing. I wasn't even doing that. But it's like there is a right way to do GP practice ownership that we've studied and replicated over and over and over. We want to give you the tools.
So yeah,
I
let's do
think
the contrast
go
now,
for it.
right? So like we were just talking about it, right? If you're listening to this episode and the pathway to ownership is interesting, then you're most likely in an associateship, right? So it's like, how can I change where I'm going every day, where I'm going somewhere with a bunch of opportunity? And so let's go back through that same buyer's representation process that we talked about before, but let's do it with the positive perspective. So let's say
Okay.
we found a good opportunity. What should we be seeing? Right. So when we go to pull the practice management reports, we're going to pull the reports on, let's just use those two things we talked about before, the number of cleanings and the crown to 3 to 4 surface filling ratios. Right. So we're going to take a look at the number of cleanings first. We're going to say, wow, there's a lot of cleanings here. There's, let's just say, 7 days a week of hygiene. Actually, I'm going to use Nesto's example. So Nesto, this practice underwater guest I'm talking about, bought 2 practices 1 month apart. And the second one was doing 790 historically, but had 7 days a week of hygiene. So
Okay.
this one we would be a proponent for. And,
Yeah.
instantly in the first year of ownership, it did over 1 million. Like it's now doing over 1 million very regularly. And that's because there was 7 days a week of hygiene, right? So there was a hygienist working 4 days a week, another hygienist working 3 days a week, and there was a seller who was just kind of coasting, right? That's what the good opportunities look like, is an ample amount of hygiene. You know, you might have 2 hygienists for every dentist there, and then you might have, and I think so. There's some things you want. You want a large patient base, and we're going to confirm that. Taking a look at the number of pro fees, the practice management reports, the schedule. We're going to like really look to make sure that that's actually the case. Then you also want to see potentially some new patient flow, right? So
Mm.
you're not going to find practices that are with like 60, 70, 80 new patients per month that are really dialed in. Like that's realistically not going to be the kind of the practice that our audience is going to be purchasing. But if you
Yeah.
can get like 20 a month, or
Yeah.
18 to 20 up to 30 per month that they're just seeing, like
Yeah.
that's signs of life. It's tough when you're like 7 or 6 or 5. Like those numbers are more concerning. So it's really just you want to find an underutilized patient base, right? I think that's kind of how you would be thinking about it. And so then looking at the crown to 3 to 4 surface filling ratio, right? You want to see something that's moderate or even conservative in their treatment approach. I think we had on the podcast Derek Williams a long time ago who purchased a practice. And I remember when I was taking a look at that opportunity, there was just an extremely large amount of large fillings that were being done compared to the number of crowns. And then when he went in there was like all these teeth being splinted together through like
Yeah.
fillings of multiple teeth. And it was
Like
like,
seven surface fillings because it connected
yeah.
to teeth. Yeah.
And that provided the opposite effect, where the dentist coming into the practice diagnoses differently, and all of a sudden that difference is positive to the practice's performance, as opposed to the full mouth rehab all on 4 location that we were just discussing, where the dentist leaves and the new dentist comes in who doesn't do those procedures. Then the practice tanks. In this situation, when done properly, you should walk into a practice and you're adding endo, or you're doing extractions, or maybe you place some implants, and then all of a sudden, like, you are doing more than the person who was there. So then you get that positive tailwind where the practice just kind of has some instant bump because of you walking in. And I think that that's like the flip side. When done well, like that's a very real and replicable outcome that most of our clients experience. And so I think that that's where it's like, from our perspective, like we really look for those large patient bases that are relatively the whole towel isn't being wrung, essentially, is what you're looking for.
Well, and this just made me, think of a new analogy, and you can tell me if it's a bad one. So I see this as like a seesaw of how many untreated patients, whether they're currently being treated and just underdiagnosed, they're not active patients anymore, they could be reactivated, or they're easy to tap into new patients. How big is this pool of patients who really have not had the full amount of dentistry offered to them that they could have been offered, versus how much dentistry is being done that you can replicate? Um, and so you've got two sides of these seesaws. So in the first example, people bought practices with next to zero patients who still have dentistry left over, and they don't have access to unreactivated patients and new patients coming knocking down the door on the way. So there's not just this line of dentistry waiting to be done on the hygiene end. It's a big function of hygiene days, current patient base. And then on the other side of the seesaw, there's dentistry they're doing that they can't replicate at a price point, a speed, an aggressiveness they don't want to replicate. And so the seesaw is completely the other way around, versus the very conservative dentist who's just a watch it on us, checked out, with a ton of work, like patients coming out the door because it's a rural practice, or they've got good reviews and it just has a good street position or has a good reputation. And there used to be 2 doctors there and now there's only one. And so there's like 1,000 patients on the books that you could reactivate. All of these things balance that seesaw out. And if you just get this part of the equation right when you purchase a practice, it's hard to go wrong. But if you get this wrong, you can be up a creek without a paddle.
Yeah, and I think I really like what you're talking about, right? I think patient flow, like, that's a big thing. Obviously, we've been talking about it for the majority of the episode, both talking about what wasn't working for those other opportunities and what is working for the ones that are great opportunities. But then your other point that you made about replicability, I think is like kind of the second most important thing to look at, which is, because so the way that practices are valued is their profitability or revenue is going to be used to really make the valuation. And so that valuation is kind of baked into that is the procedure mix, right? So was there a lot of implants, ortho, endo? Like, are those things that are making up a big portion? Like, so that 1.6 that Richard was talking about, like how much of that is stuff you don't do? Because if it's a big part of that, then that stuff you're not going to get, that's not replicable. And so you essentially are, the replicability is a really important thing to look at because it's comparing the clinical skill set of the seller and the clinical skill set of the buyer. And when done well, the clinical skill set of the buyer is greater than the clinical skill set of the seller so that you're adding procedures. When
Yeah.
done poorly, the seller who's leaving did more procedures than the person coming in, and now all of the collections that was used to value the practice is not replicable, and the new buyer cannot do all of those things, meaning that it will dip, meaning that they more or less overpaid for what they're capable of contributing. And that's where you get yourself into one of these stressful situations. And so, at a very basic level, like those are kind of the two of the most important factors. And then, you can go down the list. There's like 10 other things, but I think maybe Richard, anything else on replicability before I go to like kind of a very other important area?
On replicability, I mean, I looked at these two practices. I looked at a $2 million practice and a $1 million practice. One was dentures and didn't have implants. I knew I could add implants. One was implants and CEREC and endo and
Yeah,
cosmetics and and it's not just the replicability of can I do the dentistry. Also, that dentistry usually takes an ability to close cases
yeah,
and the trust that's been there. You're going to have a trust dip, and if your skill set is smaller, like you've double shrunk it, it's the fastest way to do the drive it off the lot and it loses value is to buy dentistry that you can't replicate.
totally. And I think that kind of heading into our next section, this is where I think everyone else does this part, which is the financial part, right? Like you have to take a very thorough look at the financials of the practice. And I think, just to kind of, this is an area that like that representation that, this person that that bought the practice that didn't work out that was represented. I'd imagine that they did like their representative focused on financial representation, looking
Yes.
at the profit and loss, making sure that those types of things were in line. And that's also an important factor, right? But in a good purchase where it's ready to grow, then you're doing your goal is that the financial analysis checks the boxes on a lower amount of collections compared to what you think you're going to be doing. So you want it to make sense at a smaller amount, and then you want to grow it versus looking at the financials and saying like, man, this really doesn't work for the amount that they're doing right now. I have to grow it by 10%, 20% for the numbers to start, adding up in my favor. And what that financial analysis looks like is a few things. The first thing that you're going to want to look at is what is my take home pay if I keep everything the same and take on a
Add the
loan from
loan.
the bank. Like, so what's the profit of the practice? What's the loan payment? And then what am I making? Like, it's just good to kind of see like that number.
Or EBITDA after debt service. Yeah, which we don't need to explain. It's just like
Yeah,
add in the loan and the true profit. What is it? What does it actually look like?
exactly. And so you want to say, okay, how much am I going to make buying this practice? And then you're like, okay, like I'm good with that number. And that's the number that you're comparing apples to apples with your current income.
It's funny. George is yawning right now. I have to tell the story. There was like an episode in season one where I was recording it with Will Little at like midnight, and I was like falling asleep as he would talk. And I had to like disguise that on the podcast. So,
Yeah. Hey.
but he didn't know because it was not video. So it was great. It worked out just fine.
Well, and so you want to look at, okay, what's my take home income? How does that compare to my current income as an associate? And then you're like, okay, like I'm good. I'm going to be increasing my income, and that is, that makes sense because I'm also increasing my debt or whatever. But then the other thing that you want to look at is what's the expense profile, and you really want to look at a few things. You want to look at the facility. You're just like, well, how
Mm.
much is the rent? What percentage of my collections is that? You really want it to be like 8% or less for the facility costs. But then the other thing that you want to look at is what's my team costs.
Yeah.
So because one of the biggest things you're going to want to do is you want to preserve the team that's there, and looking at, okay, well, is that an affordable thing for me to do? Am I going to be out of line with my costs with the team that's currently there? And so, like, those are some of the bigger things that you're looking at, in terms of where you're ordering your supplies from. That's such an easy thing to change. You come in and you're like, all right, from now on, I'm not ordering from Shine and paying the rep whatever they want. We're going to use like this. That's easy. But the team's harder. The facility is harder. The things that you're kind of more embedded into the cost of the practice, those are the things you're going to want to make sure the expense profiles kind of make sense.
Yeah. It's you can't easily change these things. These are like costs you're married to. The lease is going to be the least, and your team is not going to take a pay cut with the new doctor coming in. And those are, sometimes those are significantly inflated for the market. Like if you have a whole team, the doctor just like rather than manage their team, they just gave everyone a raise and like hoped the problems would go away and just kind of kept giving people raises and raises and raises. And now you've inherited that team who expects like a $10,000 Christmas bonus every year and XYZ and ridiculous salaries. Um, that is, if you fire everyone and start over, there's real risk in buying that practice. So it's just important to know, what am I signing up for here?
Well, I think that, from my perspective, like that's kind of like, you want to kind of recap the conversation a bit, or is there anything else you wanted to add before we kind of started wrapping up?
I think the nuance, and here's the thing, the buyer's representation that if you're going to get, for some reason, you don't do shared practices, which I'm now very pissed if you do, having listened to this episode. The thing that you're going to miss out on is the whole other half of the conversation which is, what is your vision and where do you want to
Oh
go?
yeah,
And
totally.
how does this practice have the potential to grow? This is just not buying a lemon, buying a healthy practice in its current state. And that's what prices of practices should be based on, is not their future. This is the secret. If you buy a practice based on its current healthy price point, but you can grow it, you've like given yourself such a buffer of like, oh yeah, there's low hanging fruit and I can expand this practice, versus you unwittingly buy a practice that has a bunch of liabilities and it immediately contracts. This is the night and day difference experience of practice ownership that people get into. And so that's a whole nother episode, is the buying to grow. And that's what we talk about in our course.
Yeah, so I can't believe we almost wrapped without that. It's actually like the most important thing.
It
So
is.
Suzanne asked me, I have a webinar tomorrow, so it'll be after this records, but it's about, it's for pre-owners who are in the process of acquiring it. I have the 3 biggest mistakes. I kind of like listed them. And number 1 is not beginning with their long-term vision. Like,
Yeah.
just acquiring a practice without that like really clear understanding of what you want long term and how this practice is the ideal practice to take you to that long term vision. That's like the most important thing. Then number 2 that I put on the list is acquiring a practice with the wrong set of problems. That's like what this whole episode was about. And then
Right.
the third one, which is getting too caught up in deal specifics. So like, we have somebody right now in the Ask George Mastermind who is acquiring a practice, and they have this valuation report, and like it's very easy to get really like deep into the like specifics and purchase price of 100,000 here or there, and it really takes more of that bigger picture of saying like, I want to be going every day to work to the right place that has an opportunity for me to grow, that is in line with my vision, and like has the right problems. Like that's really what you're after. And so I think, it's really that like really beginning with your end in mind is like super duper important. And then, not getting a lemon, right? Also extremely important. That can
Yeah.
make it go sour real quick. And
Yeah.
then, on the other point is not getting too caught up in stuff that's not as important as the first 2 things. And I think that that's, where like you just kind of need to zoom out and say like, look, the seller's selling their practice. It's their baby. Like I'm taking it over. I can negotiate here. I can be agreeable here so long as I get the right practice. And I think that sometimes it can get you can get a little too caught up into the specifics.
Well, people want to win. They want to like feel like, oh yeah, they've got a story. Well, the asking price was this, and their uncle is like, well, did you like offer lower? Did you like negotiate hard? And they're like, no, I didn't. Maybe I should have. They don't want to have that conversation. Whereas the reality is, if you know where you want to go, and you've done your due diligence, number two, you either know this practice is actually really overvalued and it's not even worth haggling over,
Yeah,
or this practice is truly undervalued. And I'm like, I'll buy it for this price you're asking for because I know where this thing can go. You just have confidence in the potential of what's there. And therefore, the little things back and forth at closing table, you can make sure that transition goes. And the seller's like, wow, that dentist was really great to work with. I'm going to recommend them to my team, the patients, all of that. The goodwill transfers because you're not squabbling over 25, 50K here and there.
totally. Yeah. Yep. And I think, maybe the last thing I'll say is just having the patience to wait for that practice, right? I think that a lot of people are like, well, in my area, this doesn't come onto the market or whatever, and it's like, well, go off market and find the right thing, but like, don't go into the wrong opportunity, right? And I think that a lot of times people get impatient and they're like, well, it's not perfect. I know these problems, but like, I got to go. And it's like, well, you don't really. You can wait and you can be more persistent and you can find, like I mentioned, right? If you're looking at practices on the market, you just need to know that people have passed on that practice before you've seen it. So like, just keep that in the back of your mind, and you should be asking, why hasn't anyone else purchased this yet? And I think that that's people should be more persistent and wait for the right thing.
And with that, you just unlocked another little framework for me. It's like if people who are afraid to wait a year to buy a practice, but they buy a practice that puts them 3 to 4 years behind versus 2 years ahead, because that really is the difference between the wrong practice and a prime to grow practice. Is you're now like doubled the value of a practice in a single year. You are years ahead compared to what you even paid for that practice versus I'm 3 years until I'm even break even and can breathe for once. So waiting 1 year for a 5 year differential is well worth it. And it's worth searching under every rock, every dental meeting, every rep, doing everything you can to find a good practice because it's life changing.
That's a great point. And I think that, you brought up something there. So I actually purchased a practice right out of school, which severely limited the amount of opportunities I could look at. And then I helped somebody else like a year later after I purchased buy something that was much more in line with my vision than what I bought. And so, I kind of had that experience of watching somebody else get further ahead. So like I've closed on my practice 6.5 years ago. And today we have less patients in our patient pool than this practice that I helped somebody purchase in 2019. So had I waited an extra year, I could be further ahead than where I am today, in terms of practice size, number of patients, like, all of the things that I care about. Yeah. And so it just like the waiting piece, like I think you said it perfectly, right? Being in ownership, time will go one way or another. And if it goes and speeds up, that means that, being patient to get there is in net a much better decision. So, I even for myself feel like I learned that one the hard way, where I was so adamant to get into ownership right out of school that I, ultimately bought something that required a lot of growth compared to something else that I could have waited for. And then it could have been much more there for me when I walked in.
Yeah, 100%. Well, George, this is, I mean, every time I think we can't like talk about a topic more, we like literally have epiphanies while we're talking about it. And we've been like lecturing and speaking and thinking about it because we just realized, okay, here's a new nuance to get this point across and really the importance of this. It just keeps going. So this has been a lot of fun, man. I'm excited for your webinar tonight. I'm excited for the course in July, Pathway to Ownership, July 25th to 26th. Dentist, new grad, associate dentist looking to buy their second practice, any of you should be at that course. We'll talk to you next time on the Shared Practices podcast.